Hi, everyone. Welcome to the June 2023 Community Stand-Up for Static Web Apps. I'm your host, Thomas. I'm a product manager on the Static Web Apps team. And today we have a really jam-packed schedule for you today for the Community Stand-Up. We're going to be highlighting a couple community contributions, and we're also going to be talking about a really interesting topic, which is hosting hybrid rendering frameworks on Azure Static Web Apps and how we do that. I'm going to be showing you a quick little demo of how that is done. And then, yeah, let's get into it. All right. So first off, feel free to leave any questions in the chat. I'm going to be taking a look at that as well. And I want to jump into our community contributions. So over the past month, we actually had a lot of sessions that became available. So right now, we mentioned in our last community stand-up that we had the build sessions. We delivered the build sessions at Microsoft Build. So now we have 2 build sessions that are available on demand on the Microsoft Build site. One that is about static web apps and the roadmap looking forward and answering a lot of different Q&As. And then the other one, which is on the specific topic of database connections. And we presented with Davide as well as Adrian from the API management and the SQL team. So those are 2 great sessions. Feel free to go check it out. And as well, we were on Azure Friday, Davide and I, to talk about Static Web Apps Database Connections feature. And I think that's a really good entry point to understand the value and the power behind database connections. And we make it really easy to get started from essentially from scratch to a full stack web application within 10 minutes. Now, we also had some amazing community contributions from folks. So one of them is James, that made a really great YouTube video on hosting Blazor Static Web Apps and mentioning and talking about the Visual Studio integration that we have with Blazor and Static Web Apps. And Melissa also had a conference talk at NDC London, and that recently went live on YouTube talking about Blazor and .NET, as well as Stacy, who was talking about using Azure Static Web Apps within enterprises. So those are two really excellent talks, really good resources, and feel free to go check them out. I really recommend them. Now, the topic I want to jump into is discussing hybrid rendering frameworks on static web apps. Now, we all know that hybrid rendering is a very it's a very common topic nowadays. A lot of our front-end frameworks, our favorite front-end frameworks, are adopting more and more of the server in order to provide the best performance for our users. And we on Static Web Apps, we really want to make sure that you can host these frameworks using Static Web Apps in the optimized way that you have come to expect. So I'm actually going to walk us line by line talking about this. Let me just go ahead and full screen. So I wanted to talk about hybrid rendering on Static Web Apps because it's a topic that I've been very much focused on. I'm working on the Next.js integration, and I've been playing a lot with Nuxt as well as SvelteKit. And whoops. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I don't know why. I think my camera disconnected there for a second. But yeah, like I mentioned, I've been working a lot on the Next.js integration, working for documenting the Nuxt support, as well as investigating the opportunities with SvelteKit. And I wanted to talk about hybrid rendering. So in order to talk about hybrid rendering, I feel like we have to start with static rendering. After all, we're called Static Web Apps. That's where the name originated from. And we have to look at that historical baggage in order to understand where we are today. So let me start by talking about static sites. Static sites were one of the main ways that you could get started with static web apps. So these were statically generated sites, whether they were from Hugo or Jekyll or Astro or 11T. These would either compile to HTML, JS, and CSS, and then they could be hosted on a simple static server like Static Web Apps. And we also had single page applications, right? Single page applications, which were compiled into those static single page HTML, JS, CSS. We're talking React, Angular, and Vue. And these were really convenient because they were cheap to host. You could host it basically for free and build your apps upon that. And you could even use these static sites in order to build out full stack applications by calling APIs. Right. And so with Static Web Apps, what we have is we added managed functions. So if we look below, we'll see that with static sites, you could have API requests to API backends. And then those requests could be generated. You would parse those requests in your front end and then display that data to your user. Now, of course, one of the great places to host these APIs were serverless functions, because these were scaling on demand and scaled down to zero to be the most optimized host for your APIs. So of course, with that, Static Web Apps has managed functions. It was a very convenient way to host and deploy your Azure functions from a single repo. And it made for a really compelling story when you wanted to build full stack web apps with a single option to host from your GitHub repo containing React or another SWA application, along with an Azure Functions. And then both of these would get deployed to Static Web Apps and be hosted very effectively, very efficiently. Now, over the years, what we've seen is that these SWA frameworks, these front-end frameworks, have gradually evolved to support more and more functionality and performance improvements that depended on the server, right? And so we're thinking about search engine optimization, we're thinking of image optimization. Now, these were all features that required the server in order to provide that optimal performance for the end user. And so with that, we really saw the rise of these modern web app frameworks like SvelteKit and nuxtjs and nextjs and Angular Universal. And this is specifically what the frameworks that I'm referring to when I'm talking about hybrid rendering. So with these frameworks, of course, we still have the option to have static paths, right? That's the first thing that we have to make clear. We're already familiar with that. So if you have a specific static path, it is possible for these frameworks to compile to a specific HTML file, and then that gets served globally distributed, very fast load times for those static paths. So these modern front-end frameworks could essentially build these content marketing sites where it's a lot of static paths, and you want to get the most ideal and fast load times for your end users. And so you would just go ahead and statically generate everything. But what modern front-end web apps have added for these front-end frameworks is that, give me a second, seems like my graph is jumping all over the place. But what they've added is these dynamic paths, right? And so these dynamic paths are essentially server-side rendering. So just give me a moment. I'm just going to fix this graph here, this diagram that I have. So here we go. Okay, so I call these dynamic paths. You may have heard server-side rendering or alternative ways to refer to these, but essentially these are paths where we need to provide a response that is not static, right? It will depend on the user's request, right? So in the previous case, when we were returning static assets, we weren't making any compute. We weren't computing these static assets dynamically. We were just pre-generating them at build time and then serving the static assets as is. But with dynamic paths, we now need to execute some type of operation to respond to that request. And actually, that's how we're able to provide better SEO with these dynamic paths. It's the fact that since we are able to go and operationally compute this returned value, this returned HTML on the server, then when search engines are crawling our website, they get the full data at once. So for instance, here, if we had a specific dynamic path, instead of being returned from the Static Web Apps static host, Static Web Apps is actually going to go to the backend managed Azure function, where on that backend managed Azure function, it will compute the specific HTML that needs to be returned to the user. And so let's say in this hypothetical scenario, you had to call a backend API. Well, now you could call this additional downstream API on your managed Azure function so that when the HTML is returned, then the search engine has the full information. You improve the search engine crawling, and therefore that's the search engine optimization that comes out of the box. And it also makes it faster for your customers to see your full page and the full content of your page. So this was definitely one of the missing features in the world of SPAs and static sites. And it's definitely why we've seen all of these frameworks really rise to prominence. Nowadays, a lot of folks are using these frameworks in order to build previously those single page applications. And of course, a lot of these modern front-end frameworks also give you the option to write your API requests, your endpoints within this framework. And we're going to be taking a look at that. But essentially, they'll be hosting them as specific separate endpoints so that within a single project, you are able to build your front end and your back end and your API endpoints And that's really a compelling offering because previously you sort of had to have two separate projects, right? You previously had to do your React single page application or any other SWA you chose, and then have a separate Azure Functions project. But in this case, you can have both your front end app, front end client side application, as well as specific API routes. So I think for us, we're really looking forward to better supporting all of these applications. Today, you can already deploy a lot of these nextjs, SvelteKit on static web apps. And we're definitely really excited to see what continues to come out of this landscape, because we really see that there's so many performance gains and end user experience gains that comes out of these frameworks. And we want to make it as easy as possible to host on static web apps. So with that being said, I want to show you what this looks like in actuality, right? So let me just exit this here. And I'm going to pull up my VS Code. Now here, I have a Nuxt3 project. And I chose Nuxt3 because it's one of the easiest ways to deploy to static web apps. We've been working a lot with the Nuxt team in order to provide this. And we've just had such a great collaboration and such a great framework to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and show you within here the different pages that we have. This is a very basic Nuxt project. I have a simple, let's say, a home page with which I have a few different routes, a few different pages. I have a page where I want to show you what the dynamic page would look like. And I have another one where we have a static page. Now, on both these pages, I'm making a fetch request to an API, right? I'm reproducing this situation where in the past you'd have your static HTML returned, and then you'd make an API call separately in order to fetch any data. And so clearly when this page were to run, first the app would go ahead and load the HTML. And then only once that's done, the JavaScript would run, go make a call to that API, and then include that information within the page. So this is nothing new, right? This is what we were doing with static sites before. But with these hybrid front-end frameworks, what we also have is the option to have dynamic pages. And on dynamic pages, what we can do is, and I'll show you this, but what the front-end framework is going to do is, instead of executing this fetch request on the browser, upon first page load, what this will do is it'll execute this fetch request on the server, right? So you write your JavaScript once, and depending on the configuration of this specific route, it'll run on the server or on the client. So in this case, it'll be running on the server. And then when we get the response from the browser, we'll see that it's already populated with no need to make additional API calls. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this. A simple npm run dev, and this should be pretty quick. It's using Vite. Okay. Okay, perfect. So let me load this up. And I'm also going to open the network tab just so we can take a look at this. Loading over here. Okay, perfect. So let me see in my VS Code what's the hang up. Let me bring it back up. Not sure what's happening. This was before coming on. If we can see if we can load the page. Okay. All right. I have no clue what happened there. Now we have our site. So thanks for bearing with me. And it's the most simple example, so I don't know what happened there. So in here, I have 3 separate links. These links are going to the 3 separate sort of pages that I want to show off. Now, first, we have the static page. In the static page, we'll see that whenever this page loads, we are actually making a separate API request, right? I showed you this before in the static site. What we're doing is whenever this page loads, it's going to be calling with fetch, it's going to be calling this specific API endpoint. Now, this specific API endpoint, I already have it set up in this project, and it's a simple hello world. I'm just trying to show essentially what's happening. So that's what's happening on the static side. Now, if I were to go to the dynamic page, I can show you that we are actually no longer making a separate API call, and the page is being returned with that hello world already pre-populated. So if I were to show you maybe the HTML here, I'm not sure if we're going to get that just because. Okay, so if we go to the original response, okay, here. We already have the data from our backend because that fetch request was actually made on the server, right? And so that means that whenever a user were to go directly to this page, whether that be from Google or if it's also a search engine crawler, then they would actually get all of the data pre-populated in this page. So this is typical server-side rendering, but there's something unique about this specific implementation. Now in Nuxt, they call it universal rendering. And with universal rendering, it will actually change where the API call is made based on the state of the application. So actually, if you access this dynamic page from within the application, it's now going to do client-side rendering, and you'll see if I go ahead and filter out all to only API request, you'll see that it actually made a separate API request. And that's because instead of fetching the whole HTML, it just made a simple API request and then used some JavaScript magic to add that into the page. So with this simple test, I actually was able to show you that this is actually hybrid rendering, right? A hybrid rendering means that for some specific routes, we're able to indicate that we want to be executing any logic on the server before rendering the page and returning it to the user, before rendering the HTML. And so this can be calling an API, but it can also be any computation of your HTML. So how exactly are front-end frameworks like this hosted on Static Web Apps? Well, I'm going to show you. What I'm going to do is show you what happens when we compile this application and deploy to Static Web Apps. So I already have my GitHub set up for this specific project, and I've already deployed it to Static Web Apps. And if you go and dig in the build logs, you'll see that Nuxt is actually going to use a specific preset to build for Static Web Apps. So that's a common pattern across these hybrid front-end frameworks. Is they either support adapters or specific build compilations that allow us to host this optimally on Static Web Apps, and whether that's distributed from the static site host or the managed Azure Functions backend. So what we'll see is that the Nitro server is actually going to build this Nuxt application to be hosted on Static Web Apps. I'm going to reproduce this locally so I can show you the files that are being created. So I'm going to run npm run div. And actually, I want to show you that I've previously set up a specific environment variable. when you set this environment variable, when you the Nuxt build will actually build with that in mind and then take into account this preset when it's building. So you definitely need to set this environment variable when it's being built. And this is actually being set and being detected by Nuxt within your static web apps deployment with no additional configuration. That's the beauty of Nuxt and our collaboration with them is you need no additional configuration to make this happen. So I'm just showing you here, if we were to run the build locally, there's something really interesting that happens, and I want to dive into it. What it's going to do is it's basically going to understand our current Nuxt application and our current configuration and determine which pages are static and which pages are dynamic and need a server-side computation. And it's going to package all this server-side computation code as an Azure function, and it's going to package all the static assets as those static HTML, CSS, and JS assets so that they can be hosted globally on Static Web's global host, and then the server-side Azure function will be hosted on your managed Azure function within Static Web Apps. So we can already take a look at what it's generating. We're going to be looking at the output folder because that's where all these assets are being built. And you'll see that there's a separate server folder. And in this folder, we actually have essentially this Azure Functions. It's compiled, right? It's intended for the Azure Function host to understand. It's not really made to be legible, but I'm just walking through here in order to show you that this is essentially what's happening. A lot of different chunks. You'll see that we have our specific hello API that's being compiled into a root for that, and then other different server files. So it's not, this isn't intended to be used or edited. These are actually just built assets that are going to be hosted on Static Web Apps. And then the other thing that it does is it compiles any static assets into this public folder. So you'll notice that previously I had an index.view and a static.view file, and these are actually compiled into those different pages. So that index.html within this public folder represents the index.view, and this static.view becomes this index.html. I can show you as well, this is the test static that I had within this static.view right here. Right? So we can see that this file actually got compiled into this static asset, is going to be served as a static HTML file. Meanwhile, the dynamic page is actually going to be served from, if I can scroll all the way back up, it is actually going to be served from this server function. So if I were to show you, we have a specific server.mjs, and then from here we're creating the dynamic page inside of here. So as you can see, this is how these assets, this framework compiles to HTML and an Azure function in order to be hosted on Static Web Apps. And the last thing I want to point out is it actually generated this staticwebapp.config.json. Now, you're probably already familiar with staticwebapp.config.json, but it allows you to configure any runtime redirects or parameters or configurations that you want on your application. So this file was actually generated by the Nitro server here and this nuxt build command. And what it does is it's going to be redirecting our specific /static root in our application, right? Like we had here, and it's going to be redirecting it or rewriting it to the static /HTML /index.html file. So this file here. And what that means is when Static Web Apps receives a request to the /static endpoint or path, it's going to be returning the value of this rewritten path. So it's going to go into this path in order to get the content and then return that from this path. And same thing for this simple backslash, this home page that I have. It's going to be returning the value of the index.html and any other paths. So in this case, my /dynamic path will not be served by these static HTML files, but instead it's going to be served from the server. And so it's going to not be served by any of these routes. It's going to hit the navigation fallback, and then it's going to be served from the API server, which is essentially that managed Azure function that is going to compute that dynamic route and then return that to the end user. So I can show you that this is my application, the same one that I showed you before, but this is the one deployed on Static Web Apps. And if I were to go to the network tab and then go to my /dynamic route, what we'll see is that this is actually going to be hitting the backend Azure function. And if I were to load up my network tab, you'll see that there's actually no additional API call. That's because, like I mentioned before, this is all, any API calls are actually happening on the managed Azure function, and we're receiving the HTML with all this data already included. And then the static works as you'd imagine. It does make that API call because that's what I instructed Nuxt to do for this specific path. So this is really the power and the beauty in these front-end frameworks is they compile all of this to optimize where they should be hosted, right? If these are static assets, they should be hosted globally on Static Web Apps static host. And then if there are any dynamic paths, they are to be hosted on the managed Azure function and served from that. So this is something that's really easily configured. You'll see that this is how I configured my next path in order to indicate that I wanted these two paths to be pre-rendered. And then the other one, the dynamic path, to be that universal rendering, which gets rendered on the server if it's the first time, and then on the client if it's being accessed from any other page in the application. So all in all, I really think that for these front-end frameworks, the hybrid rendering on Static Web Apps is an excellent place to begin. They've made it really easy to build these very powerful applications and make the most out of this. So I actually see that Sergey had a question in the chat. Sergey asks, what is generating the API functions? And that's a good question. So what's happening is when we run the npm run build command, in this case, it's going to be running nuxt build. Nuxt is going to be using Nitro in order to build the Nuxt application into the specific files and assets that are needed to be hosted on Static Web Apps. So Nitro is a specific package that the Nuxt team has been working on in order to make it really easy to host Nuxt on any specific platform. In this case, we have the Azure Static Web Apps preset. And so what Nuxt is going to do is it's going to be building our application, our Nuxt application, into this set of Azure functions, right? And so within this server, within this functions, you will see that there are different, there's code in here that's been compiled from our Nuxt application by Nitro in order to have these either dynamic routes or these API routes hosted on the managed Azure function. So yeah, that's a great question, Sergey. And that's what I mean when I say that it's the beauty of these front-end frameworks. It's the fact that all this heavy lifting is done on your behalf in order to optimize where these different paths and this different compute should be hosted. Now, I've actually talked to a lot of customers that are using these front-end frameworks like Next, Nuxt, SvelteKit, Angular Universal, and they actually find it very convenient to either build full stack web apps, right? End to end, where any API endpoints or dynamic paths have the access to any downstream databases or APIs in order to build that self-contained full stack apps. And on the other side, I've talked to a lot of companies and a lot of teams that have opted to use these front-end frameworks essentially as front-end and back-end for front-end type of experience, right? So when we think of the back-end for front-end pattern, we think of a specific set of APIs or back-end API calls that are optimized for the front end in order to reduce any client waterfall and to make it as optimized in terms of what backend APIs are being called. So as you can see with the power of these applications within a single application, you can then call a lot of downstream APIs in the case where you have potentially many different services that are providing APIs from this single front-end framework application. You can make these calls to these APIs, and you no longer need to have a specific backend for front end. It's built in within this within this front end application. So, hey, this is the demo that I had prepared for you today. We were able to see with this specific example of Nuxt how we are building the application and hosting it on Static Web Apps, both on the static site host and the managed Azure functions. If you want to go ahead and get started specifically with Nuxt, we have a great tutorial on our docs as well as Next. And if I were to, and so the other one is SvelteKit. We've been working a lot with Geoff from the SvelteKit team in order to work on an adapter for SvelteKit for static web apps. And we've been working hard in order to provide him with any of the functionality that is needed within static web apps in order to host SvelteKit applications on static web apps. And we're definitely looking forward to hosting more of these front-end hybrid rendering frameworks on static web apps. So whether that be any future possibility, Angular Universal, Remix, Quick, I know there are some community efforts that have already started in order to support hosting those on static web apps. So yeah, that's essentially everything that I wanted to talk about today. I think hybrid rendering is really compelling for specific use cases. It complements the different SSGs and the SPAs very well for a specific use case, and it gives a lot of functionality. Okay, so we have actually another question by Sergey. Sergey asks, can one use a SWA database connection together with hybrid rendering? That's a very good question. So right now, database connections has been built mainly to be accessed from the front end, right? Mainly to be accessed from the client in a separate data API call. And by doing so, we're able to inject any authentication headers that are needed in order to provide the permissions access in your database connection. Now, of course, it would be possible to call any data API routes from your managed Azure functions. But the only thing is that when you're calling it from your managed Azure functions, we wouldn't have the information about the user permissions, right? And so in that case, you wouldn't have access to the fine-grained authorization and permissions of database connections. And I think it's one of the most compelling features. So right now we're working to find a way to provide those permissions and that authorization within the database connection when it's being called from that managed function. So yeah, it's a very good question, Sergey. I hope it answered it, and it's actually something that we're really aware of and working to provide support with static web apps, any of these managed functions and hybrid rendering and database connections. Today, if you did want to use database connections with one of these frameworks, one of these hybrid rendering frameworks, I would recommend that you use that as a static path or a pre-rendered path and make any calls to database connections as a client-side call. So you could still have any hybrid rendering, but make your call to database connections via hybrid rendering. Or if it can be pre-rendered or static without any need for authorization, then of course you can make that call to database connections. Awesome. Okay, that's it. That's all I had for you today for this Static Web Apps community stand-up. Thank you so much for joining. I appreciated the chat. I really it was great answering your questions, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next edition of the Static Web Apps community stand-up. Thanks, everyone.